All right, here we go with the notes on the skull. As you can see, it's chapter 5 in the present anatomy textbook that we're using. Hopefully I'm talking loud enough that the recording, when you listen, will be easier to hear. I don't know if I have much control over the clarity when you make the screen larger on the video or not, but let's give it a shot. One thing before we start with the notes, I want to show you a website on my webpage. This is under Chapter 5 Skeletal System, the helpful links for learning. The site from Seattle Central Education, you should really check it out. I want to show you what it looks like. It'll be very helpful when studying the skeleton. Little housekeeping, but then you get into excellent diagrams, descriptions, the different types of bones. There's your terms again, the bone markings. They give some examples. Talk about the long bone, and then they work into the bones of the axial and appendicular skeleton. It's an excellent, excellent site to know about and to keep handy. So it is a link for Chapter 5 on my website. Okay, back to the notes. All right. When we talk about the skull, basically it's two parts. It's the bones of the cranium and then the bones of the facial skeleton. Some of the terms that you're going to need to know would be condyle, foramen, fossa, process, suture, and sinuses. So make sure as you're learning all this terminology that you understand what those words mean, because it'll definitely make a difference in understanding the lecture. Okay, the cranium encloses and protects your brain, and it contains sinuses. And as you saw from above, sinuses are air-filled cavities connected to the nasal cavity. If you've ever had a sinus headache or a sinus infection, you know what that's like or where they are. Okay, come on. Let's see. There we go. All right, cranium. So, as we look at the cranium itself, and if you have a picture of the skull handy, you can take a look at these bones as you fill in the notes. The frontal bone, of course, is the anterior portion of the skull above the eyes. Now, here's where some of those other terminology comes in. Supra means above. An orbital is where your eyeballs are. It's that socket. And a foramen is an opening. So, the supraorbital foramen is a tiny opening where blood vessels and nerves pass into your forehead, found in the frontal bone. And there are frontal sinuses in that bone also. Then if you move backwards, you now have two parietal bones. They make up the sides and roof of the cranium, and they come together at what we call a suture. So it's an immovable joint. They fuse together at the midline for the sagittal suture. And again, the term sagittal, think about what that means. And then coronal fuses to the frontal bone. Going back to the far back of your skull, you have the occipital bone. The base of the cranium, the back of the skull. And again, there's names for the sutures, which are the joints between these flat bones of your skull. Lambdoidal suture fuses to the parietal bones. And then, when you were working on exercise 13, one of the questions was, what's the largest foramen in the skull? Well, here's your answer. It's the foramen magnum. This is the large opening through its inferior surface through which the spinal cord extends between the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. So I'll show you that in class when I take the skull off of our skeleton, how it fits. This opening fits right where the spinal cord then extends into the vertebral canal. And then you have the occipital condyles, which articulate with the first vertebra for head movement. Remember that a condyle is a rounded process of bone, and so I'll also show you that when I take the skull and show you how it sits on top of that first vertebra. All right, so quick review. Frontal bone, 2 parietal bones on the sides. Way in the back, at the base of the skull, is the occipital bone. Then we have 2 bones again on the sides. The temporal bones. These are the sides of your skull and the base of the cranium. They're located below the parietal bones. Again, you can see some more terminology. The squamosal suture fuses temporal bones to parietal. External auditory meatus. Meatus is a tube or a tunnel-like canal. It opens in the temporal bone, leads inward to your ear. So yeah, think about now you're on the side of your head, and this is like your ear canal. Mandibular fossae. These are the depressions that articulate with your mandible, which is your jaw. They're located anterior or in front of the meatus. The mastoid process, and again, remember, a process is a prominent projection. That's where your neck muscles attach. This is posterior or behind the styloid process. The styloid process, you'll see by looking at diagrams or looking at the skull, is very fine, like a stylus. And it's a place where muscles of your tongue and pharynx anchor, and that's located below the meatus. And then the last part of your temporal bone is the zygomatic process, and that joins the zygomatic bone to form your cheekbone. So you can feel your cheekbones. That is your zygomatic arch. When you touch the front of on your face, that's the zygomatic arch, your cheekbones. Okay, and then we are at the last 2 bones of the cranium. Sphenoid, which is found at the base of the cranium, the side of the skull, and the floors and sides of orbits. Again, locators on the sphenoid bone, the sella turcica, a saddle-shaped process occupied by the pituitary gland. So when we talk about your brain and the nervous system, we'll talk about the pituitary gland. This is where you would find it, within your sphenoid bone of your skull. It's an upward projection of the sphenoid bone, the sella turcica. There, of course, are sinuses in the sphenoid bone. And remember, a foramen is an opening, so the optic foramen is a round hole in the medial wall. So think about where medial is now when we're talking direction. This, of course, is where the optic nerve passes through on its way to the brain. Okay, last bone would be the ethmoid bone. A small bone anterior in front of the sphenoid bone, forms a part of the cranial floor, the orbital walls, and your nasal cavity walls. Distinguishing characteristics of the ethmoid bone would be the cribriform plate, the crista galli, the perpendicular plate, the superior and middle nasal conchae, and the ethmoid sinuses. So again, there's only eight bones that your cranium is composed of, but within each bone there's defining characteristics that you're going to need to be able to identify, because they're going to help you identify the location of the bone within the skull. Okay, let's see. I think we'll go ahead and take a break before we go on with the facial skeleton.